Great, excellent. We're ready to go. We're rolling. So everybody, welcome. Very big welcome to everybody. This is the 12th digital discovery session that we're hosting. My name is David Jensen. I am the UNEP's digital transformation coordinator. Now, for those that have not yet joined us before, these digital discovery sessions offer an opportunity to really conduct a 2-hour deep dive into a specific environmental application of digital technology. And these sessions tend to focus on 3 core areas: climate action, biodiversity conservation, and pollution prevention. Now, these digital discovery sessions were initially created for UNEP colleagues as part of our new digital transformation program, but we decided to open these up to all stakeholders as a joint learning and networking opportunity. So I want to welcome all UNEP colleagues who are here, as well as all the stakeholders that are joining us from the private sector, from the public sector, from academia, from civil society. Welcome to everybody. Now, these sessions aim to provide a safe space for peer-to-peer learning to really inform, enable, and inspire your own digital transformation journeys. And these sessions are really meant to be informal. They're meant to be informal between colleagues, helping each other in the spirit of digital collaboration. And we have an incredible session today that's going to focus on open digital infrastructures for global climate innovation and accounting. And I'm expecting to have my mind blown by the content and the excellent speakers we have lined up for you. So let me introduce the 3 of them that are going to host the session today. First, we have Catherine Foster. Catherine, if you could just wave. She is the director. She is the community director of the Open Earth Foundation, a lead consultant on the UN Task Force dialogue on big fintechs and sustainable development, and a newly appointed at the Social Alpha Foundation as a fellow. Welcome, Catherine. Second, we have Sherwood Moore. He is the co-chair of the Climate Action and Accounting Special Interest Group, the CA2SIG with the Linux Foundation, and working on the Hyperledger blockchain platform. And finally, we have Martin Weinstein, who is the founder and lead scientist at the Yale Open Innovation Lab and the executive director of the Open Earth Foundation. The Open Earth Foundation is a research and deployment for nonprofit focusing on digital innovations and open collaborations around planetary scale projects such as Open Climate. So in terms of the format today, we're going to have 2 main sessions. One tag team session between Catherine and Sherwood, followed by a Q&A session, and then a second session led by Martin, followed by a Q&A session. So the entire format should last between 1.5 to 2 hours. Please feel free to actively use the chat to share ideas, to share key questions and share links. And be aware that the session is being recorded and it will be posted on the SparkBlue Codes platform to view and to share with other colleagues who couldn't attend today. So without further delay, let me hand the floor over to Catherine.
Pleasure to be here. You'll have to pardon me, I have a bit of a cold. First one since the whole COVID crisis. Bit of a cracking voice. I'm so pleased to be here, and David, thank you for the opportunity. And I'm also very pleased to be here with my 2 colleagues, Sherwood and Martin. I think together we have sort of a meeting of minds, and I want to start at the very beginning of the journey for me professionally, and what brought me into the tech space and open digital transformation space. I'm a former Canadian diplomat who focused on human security and climate, and I'm going to start sharing my screen, a window, and I went on to leadership positions with the EU Climate Kick, which is Europe's flagship climate innovation partnership, and this accelerated over 1,000 startups that focused on climate and sustainability innovation. And I then went on to work with the Green Digital Finance Alliance, which was set up by Ant Financial and UNEP as an NGO, and was a knowledge partner and Sherpa to the UN Secretary General's Task Force on Digital Financing. I've also worked with the United Nations and the World Bank, as well as with numerous startups and accelerators, and including with a startup directly focusing on open innovation that won MIT Solve. I say all this because within that period, I struggled to scale these innovations, including the hundreds of innovations in Climate Kick, the thousands of innovations. Having served on all sides, the policy, the technical, even grant giving, I started examining the solution space and the narrative of the innovation itself that is seeing this fragmented space evolve with little scaling of pilots and impacts. And so I thought I'd provide a brief overview of that and some of the thoughts that I've been publishing lately, including in some reports that I'll outline afterwards. And this is what brought me to work with Martin Weinstein at the Open Earth Foundation. And I'm actually old enough to know, to have been there for the Stockholm 1972 conference. And it's been 50 years since Stockholm and 30 years since the Earth Summit. And this is significant. The Earth Summit was significant because of the representation of governments and non-government organizations and other stakeholders, and because of the multifaceted definition of sustainability and the means of implementation that were examined. So we started on a good footing with this Agenda 21 blueprint, as well as the action guide for local to international cooperation. And collaboration was a fundamental tenet of the vision. This also marked the link between various initiatives, including the Conventions on Biological Diversity, Forestry, and of course, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And what I find interesting is the solution space that has evolved to address those common goals that have grown out of this political, economic, and regulatory ecosystem and infrastructure are the common transformation gaps that we're still facing. And that includes issues of financing, issues of efficiency of the initiatives that are emerging out of the different sectors and the different initiators of these initiatives. We also have some credibility issues with replication, duplication, even issues in cases of delivery, of impact, measuring impact, and also the incentivization in this space. The focus on financing and procurement and how it's evolved and continues to play out. And what we find is that we actually have a very fragmented solution space. It's about silos and replication. And what is also interesting is the framing of sustainable development goals and climate as market opportunity. And it's the culture, and this is what I really wanted to talk about briefly, is the culture of innovation is based on this notion where we take the examination of the financing necessary to meet these SDG and climate financing gaps, and they're held up as market opportunity for innovation and technology. The trillions that are needed to be mobilized to achieve the SDG goals and the finance gap, this market estimate are based on these estimations, and the data is presented as the market opportunity, and that's how actually we're pitching in the field. And the available finance is not really channeled always towards sustainable development goal at the speed required to achieve that. And we have a growing gap rather than decreasing gap. And the notion of innovation in tech in particular is that we can actually just plug and play. But tech is an evolution and an ecosystem build, and that's not really represented in the way we're doing innovation. In terms of emerging tech and blockchain in particular, we're seeing clusters of pilots and other initiatives that have been developed with myriad use cases to support global climate and sustainability goals, particularly in these clusters of energy, circular economy, and carbon markets. And the application of digital ledger technology or blockchain for use cases has particularly been held up. And in the Climate Chain Coalition, for example, which is a collaborative membership organization, here we also see hundreds of members working on specific pilots and initiatives, but they're not scaling to the extent they could or should be. And instead, what we're seeing is this fragmented solution landscape internationally, both as well as in terms of the actual initiatives. And the solution space, from my perspective in my studies, has basically evolved within the culture of the space that actually created the SDG and climate gaps to begin with. And so this is sort of that flexion point that we're at, where we have legacy procurement and investment processes. We have big physical, digital, and data divides. We have this homogenous tech and innovation culture where more and more we're adopting Silicon Valley approaches and pitching and funding and winner-take-all culture. And we're disconnecting all of this from the legacy infrastructure and systems. And so what we're seeing, of course, is technology and project silos and this fragmented solution landscape. And in order to solve for that solution landscape, through these various studies and initiatives, we've realized that we need to address a number of things, including governance and standards, data and information, the culture of innovation itself in terms of an ecosystem rather than as a one-off process. We need to integrate stakeholders and the pilots, and we need to do this through collaborative processes, scaling frameworks, open platforms, and infrastructures. Some of the tools that you can find and resources I will provide to the group, and these include an IID briefing on climate finance, a new chapter on blockchain and sustainable development, a digital green bonds framework, and also the UN Task Force report, People's Money, where a number of the tools that we shared as knowledge partners are included. And forthcoming are 3 new publications that I provided as 6 new mandated publications for the extended dialogue on global finance. So hopefully you'll find some of the tools there useful, including a tiered impact table, an SDG, sustainable development and ESG lens, as well as a number of use cases, and also a paper on digital currency and CBDCs. But I think it's time to pass the baton over to Sherwood to talk about one of the specific angles and one of the specific topics that I just mentioned, that is the global climate accounting system.
Thanks, Catherine. So do you want to, Pat, should I try to share my screen? Is that the best way to do this?
Perhaps, that would be good.
Okay. Let's see if I can do that, okay.
I probably have to stop mine.
All right.
And Martin, when you kick off, could you mind trying to maximize your screen just so we can see it better? There we go. That's perfect. Thanks.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, yeah, so I guess I'll share a little bit about my backstory too in coming to climate accounting and coming to work with Martin. I was working on a kind of a startup idea, trying to figure out how to kind of crack the code on introducing different cities to climate action, kind of drive action at the local level. And the problem that I was really facing was just the problem of incentive. And then so when I kind of came across the work of climate accounting and the ability to kind of track different activities, different actions, I realized that this is kind of foundational to anything that I was trying to build, and also much more interesting and much more critical. So a little bit of background. Okay. I think I hear now. Yeah, so I kind of switched gears really quickly and joined a climate action and accounting special interest group with the Hyperledger Foundation, which Martin started. And during my time there, eventually kind of took the reins over as co-chair, and it's been just kind of a learning experience since then. And here I am talking to all you great people today. So I'm gonna basically provide a high-level introduction to global climate accounting. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start off by really kind of trying to frame up the problem of climate change and describe what really makes it such a unique challenge. I'm gonna speak a little bit about just the importance of accounting to human collaboration in general, and then I'm gonna dive in to the climate accounting solution. and I'll share about what it is, how it works, technologies that will make it possible, and the promise that global climate accounting can deliver. So when we look at the challenge of climate change, it's obviously one of the greatest challenges that the human race has ever faced, and it's because of the breadth and the depth of the transformational change that's going to be needed. So we're looking at a problem that's going to have to take the coordinated and collaborative effort of 195 countries, every single company that's out there. There are 1.7 million traditional C corps, and change the behavior of 7.8 billion people on the planet. So that's just the breadth of the problem. Now, to the right, I have an example of a supply chain for a lithium battery. So this is just the supply chain for one product for one company. And each resource going into it represents a web of additional supply chains. So each step creates emissions that we need to find a new way to curb. And this is how deep the challenge goes. And manufacturing is obviously just one of those challenges. So essentially what we're being asked to do is take on the largest change management project known to man ever. And failure isn't an option. And compounded on that, we have very little time. I'm not going to dive into it too deeply. Everybody kind of knows what we're facing, but we have to have carbon emissions every year or every decade for the next 3 decades and reach net zero by 2050. Now, it took 45 years between the first Earth Day and the agreement of the Paris Accord. That's how long it took humanity to act. And so this is kind of our baseline. And I'm not trying to be defeatist when I'm describing that, but what I'm trying to convey is that business as usual probably isn't going to work. And they're really going to need to evolve the way that we do things. And the third real challenge is kind of trying to frame up this problem of climate change is just the fact that we're faced with the task of the first time having to come together to manage a global asset, and because we're trying to work together to solve that particular issue, it's going to require a new type of radical collaboration. Because let's face it, we're not accustomed to operating at this level. We're accustomed to operating at the company or the industry or the country level, and so for the first time, we're going to have to operate as a collaborative, cohesive group. And that's not something that humankind has done yet. And so we need to develop the tools that allow us to do that. And so the question is, how do we drive this type of global collaboration? And the answer is accounting. Accounting is what fuels the organizational power of humans. Whether you look at global corporations or governments or nonprofits, any organization that's coordinating its efforts across borders or industries, that's marshaling people and resources to achieve organizational goals. The foundation of this ability to coordinate effectively is accounting. And the reason for this is that shared accounting tools help groups come together and have kind of transparent access to the same information, trust that information is going to be correct, and access to update information so they can make informed decisions. And so this provides a foundational effect. Working from the same source of trusted information is what enables accountability. It's what empowers individual stakeholders to take action in their spheres of influence. And so this is critical to driving innovation, to test new ideas, to deploy resources where they're needed the most, and tackle extremely complex challenges globally. So this is foundational to the kind of collaboration that we talk about, but it's so difficult to accomplish. And so the challenge is that without a global accounting system, it's going to be really difficult to organize a coordinated effort of this scale. And for this reason, this is the reason we're suffering from a lot of the challenges that Catherine described earlier. That lack of transparency and the lack of trust and credibility, and the misaligned incentives, the efficiency challenges, the fragmentation and waste, the stifled innovation. This is all due to the fact that we're not able to work from the same source of information. So managing a global asset like the Earth's environment is going to require a global climate accounting system. And the good news is that climate change can be understood as an accounting problem. We have 276 billion tons of emissions that remain in our global budget before we push the average temperature above 1.5 degrees. So that is our budget. Basically, it means that, you know, we have 276 billion tons that we can fit into the atmosphere before we kind of push past the 1.5 degrees. So the accounting challenge itself, it can be seen in the ledger below. On the left-hand side, it's the amount of carbon budget we're using up. And on the right-hand side is the amount we're crediting to our account by pulling carbon back out of the atmosphere. So last year, we added 51 billion, we used up 51 billion tons of our budget. And at the current rate, we have about 6.5 years to go before we're in the red, below the 1.5 degrees. Now, we're taking action right now that's going to push that obviously further down the line. But the point is that all the complexity of climate change can be understood by this single global carbon ledger. Now, each side is made up of millions of, or potentially billions of climate actions across countries and companies and individuals. But this provides us with the ability to kind of get our arms around the problem and kind of work at it in a unified fashion. So climate accounting, the field of climate accounting, it's an emerging field with the purpose of bringing together the tools and the stakeholders and this global climate accounting system a reality. And the end goal is really just to provide all global stakeholders with that transparency, with that trust, with that real access to real-time information that's going to be needed to work together to drive that accountability and that empowerment and the innovation that's going to need to fuel the global collaboration that we're going to need. So a decade ago, this would have been an impossible conversation to have because the technology just wasn't there. But we now have the technologies in place that make this, that can make this a reality. And so I want to run through those really quickly. The global ledger itself, we believe can be driven by blockchain technology. Now, there's a lot of confusion around blockchain. There's a lot of smoke out there, but fundamentally, blockchain is just a new type of database technology. Instead of being managed by one organization, it's open and managed by many. So each organization that's involved is keeping their own copy of the database, and they're checking it against others to reach consensus of any changes made. Well, the benefit of that of blockchain and why it would work so well for a global climate accounting framework or system is first that it's transparent and it's open. And that allows, it's particularly useful because it allows all stakeholders the ability to update information and also use that information in real time. It also provides a high level of trust, and there are two reasons for this. One is that it's not managed by one organization; it's managed by many. So there's no kind of concern about one organization kind of fudging the numbers. The second piece is that it's immutable. So all the information, all the different changes that are ever made on that database are always available for everybody to see. And so that has kind of a psychological effect on people and companies because, you know, if you put incorrect information into the system, that information is going to be visible in perpetuity. 5, 10, 15 years down the line, somebody might come knocking on your door asking questions, and nobody wants to have that number of sleepless nights. So it provides a really great platform and incentive for organizations to tell the truth. The second piece is, or the third piece is privacy mechanisms. And so, you know, blockchain allows for different layers of privacy so that organizations can protect different aspects of what they're sharing and only share the information that's relevant to climate change. And the reason that I've mentioned that and the reason that's important is because without that, organizations probably wouldn't be willing to share their information on the platform. So there are privacy mechanisms to make that a realistic proposition. I'm going to move down now to the actual climate action inputs. Now, this refers to all those millions or potentially billions of climate actions that we're seeing every year. Every single action needs to be measured and reported and verified. And so when I say climate action, I mean either emissions or some sort of action that is, removing emissions out of the atmosphere or decreasing emissions. So every single climate action has to be measured, reported, and verified. And you can imagine that's not very scalable. It's quite expensive. Right now, a lot of people are using Excel sheets, and so it's not really automated. And the technology that we now have, the Internet of Things, and the advent of really inexpensive sensor technology and the ability to capture information, along with artificial intelligence, now make it possible for us to develop tools and technologies to automate this process, get this information into the system, in real time, inexpensively, in a scalable way. So that's the second piece. And the final piece is the data analysis, and this is where some real value comes into play as far as being able to get our arms around this challenge. You can imagine when we have tremendous amounts of of data around these different climate actions in the kind of same language, in an interoperable layer of kind of shared information, artificial intelligence, machine learning provide tools that we can really use to dig deep and analyze this data. And so this provides us with the opportunity, to identify anomalies where information is incorrect. So, for example, if a company 10 years ago put a bunch of information in the system that isn't correct, that would be discoverable. We can also identify patterns of success, obviously, to optimize our efforts, and also help stakeholders share and learn from the different successes and failures, so that we can kind of learn from our efforts and collaborate better together. So ultimately, what I'm describing is the tool that we need to digitize the climate challenge and bring it into a digital world. So all the different actors and the climate actions, from mitigation to adaptation to finance, can be captured and converted into actor IDs, domains, registries, certifications, digital records, and ledgers. And this is so critical because it's such a complex problem. We need to be able to track and manage and analyze and work with this information in a digital environment to be able to tackle and balance such a complex challenge. So I want to end by speaking a little bit about the promise of global climate accounting. And this goes back to the very beginning of my presentation when I kind of highlighted some of the challenges of climate change. And starting off with this issue of scale. Climate accounting essentially is delivering an operating system for humanity to manage our global carbon account across all borders, industries, and human activities. So with a climate accounting system in place, you can imagine a world where the global stock take takes place not only at the global level, but at the country's level, the state level, down to the city level, company, individual, and product level in real time. You can imagine a world where we have the transparent information that we need and open standards to support seamless trading of carbon credits across the world, where stakeholders across supply chains or value chains are able to rapidly test, innovate, and implement new technologies, business models, and incentive structures so that we can, change the way that we operate, where all of us can finally calculate, understand, and respond to the cost of carbon in everything we produce and consume. With the issue of time, global climate accounting will allow us to meet the timeline, the tight timeline that we have for the Paris Agreement, by enabling all global stakeholders to take action within their spheres of influence. And for that, I just want to share a bit of anecdotal evidence, a story that just some experience we have with a member of the Climate Action and Accounting Special Interest Group that I'm now co-chairing. This member is working with a major manufacturer to pilot a blockchain solution, to track the carbon emissions just through the supply chain for one piece of one kind of car. And just what they found was just by providing transparency across this one particular supply chain, they saw emissions drop by 3% in 1 year. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot, but you have to keep in mind, this was without any government mandate. It was without any company policy. It was without any incentive. It was just through the power of transparency. And I think that can kind of give you an idea of what can, that challenge of the supply chain and the number of supply chains that we have. I think it kind of shows what can be accomplished. You can imagine what can be accomplished if you had that transparency with government policy or with kind of company incentive. And it really kind of shows how we can tackle that particular complex kind of sticky problem. And just kind of rounding this out, global climate accounting essentially is providing the platform of the operating system that we're going to need to usher in this new era of human collaboration. Because essentially it provides a way for us to be able to track carbon, across pretty much everything that we produce and we consume, and really begin to kind of get our arms around this problem. So I'll pause there, and I think we were going to go into Q&A before Martin kind of follows up with how this is actually being built, and provide some really kind of exciting real world examples of what's being done.
That's great. Thank you so much, Catherine and Sherwood. Perfect introduction. We're going to pause, as you said, right now for about 20 minutes to do the first Q&A. Sherwood, if you can stop sharing your screen and put yourself back on cam, that would be great. And I'm going to hand the floor over. There's a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to hand it over first to Nicholas Hagelberg, who is our climate change coordinator. He has the question that's obviously, I think, burning in many people's minds. So Nicholas, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks, David. Thanks, Catherine and Sherwood. Really interesting topic. Two questions. One, will hell have to freeze over before this comes into the enhanced transparency framework discussions, and that countries would agree to something like this? And then the second question that I didn't finish in the chat box yet is that would it be possible to get greater clarity on consumption and production-based emissions if we would use blockchain? So the kind of tracking the whole of, let's say, fossil fuel value chain with blockchain, and then identify who benefits from the transaction and usage of fossil fuels, so that we would move forward on that complex discussion about production and consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions. Over to you.
Thanks, Nicholas. Catherine and Sherwood, we're going to go question by question.
Well, I'll lead off by saying that yes, I think we all realize what we're asking, is going to be kind of a big ask, in the near term for a lot of different companies to be able to kind of open up their books and different, special interest to open up to show that level of transparency, because it just doesn't seem like that sort of thing is a possibility. But what I'll say is, when humans' backs are against the wall, you can see evidence of humanity kind of turning on a dime, and things we didn't think were possible are possible. I think about kind of the mobilizations of kind of some of the different world wars, where America, for example, went from kind of a backwater with no military to a global force. Or I think about the space race. I think that our back is against the wall more than those two instances. And so I think a lot of the things that we think are an impossibility are very quickly going to become a possibility with the pressure that's going to be put on all of us. And so I guess what I would respond to is I'd say that we have the wind at our backs. I think it'll be a long fight. I think it'll be a series of breakthroughs. But I think ultimately we're going to have a system like this if we're going to be successful, and I think we have to be successful.
I would like to augment this. I think it absolutely spot on. I think the way that this will happen is through solutions like we're going to be discussing through Martin's presentation. I was there for Kyoto and realized that having a centralized top-down system isn't the way to go. in terms of global climate accounting. But what we're seeing in the landscape is it's sort of, if you take the analogy of the internet, right now people are building out separate websites and everyone's doing it in their own way, but no one's built the internet. So this is kind of what needs to happen. We need to be able to link these solutions together in an open and collaborative way. Collaboration has become a bit of a trope because we don't have the tools to actually make that happen, even though it's SDG 17. But this can actually happen through these types of platforms and integrated approaches. I also wanted to address the issue of traceability of emissions. The solution that I built out with Blockchain Labs for Open Collaboration was a maritime fuel traceability app. And here is a perfect example of the incentivization element of how and why this is DLT solutions are happening and basic integrated technology solutions are happening. There was an emission change in 2020. There was a cap on sulfur, and no one was ready to meet that cap. And that includes the ship owners, the insurance agencies. There was no way to trace mixed bunker fuel. So you had to start step by step by providing a capacity for supply chain traceability, recognizing that there were myriad inputs. Data was still being handwritten in some ledgers, and the incentivization behind it. And what we had to do was go to the core. The incentivization would come from the insurance agencies saying, we are not going to cover any damage to machines, to engines that are done through dirty fuel. Therefore, you have to actually, as a ship owner, prove that you were compliant. So the whole fuel compliancy wasn't about the sulfur cap. It was about the insurance. It was about the accounting. It was about the financial incentivization behind it. And what this did was it managed to convene the stakeholders across the value chain, from the fuel suppliers to the bunkers, up to the insurance agencies, and even to the ship users, the cargo, IKEAs, the Tony Ciappellonis of the world who were doing their, supplying their, using the ships to supply their cargo and to move their cargo. So this was a consortium-based approach. It was a collaborative approach that had to look at the end-to-end value chain, and it's still ongoing. It's a very slow-moving process. So this, to me, is an example of some of the work that's happening across these different value chains that now need that international infrastructure that has to happen in that way as well.
Great, thank you for that detailed answer. I'm going to pass the floor over to Amy Lewers. Amy is the head of sustainability science at Microsoft. She's a long-term colleague for many of us. So Amy, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, David. This is so great to have you guys organize this. It's super interesting. I wanted to ask a question about the sort of upstream in terms of the measuring. And I will say I came in a little bit late, so you might have covered this, but I super agree the challenges of accounting, and as a company, we're trying to also figure out even, how we can support this in the context of effectively creating markets for removal, because we've, as a company, committed to removing all of the carbon we've emitted since the start of our company. And a carbon accounting, of course, makes that really complicated in terms of developing a market. But upstream of that, it seems like the measuring of emissions and step at scaling an improved measurement system is fundamental to having a good accounting system. And I'm not sure I heard a discussion about that and how far away we think we're on that, right? Our current bottom-up estimations are, hugely off and don't add up to our global accounting that the global carbon budget does every year. So I'm just wondering what's the limiting rate here, limiting step here? Is it the improving measurement, or is it the accounting? And the other is the thing that I've been thinking about internally in terms of how can we help address this is like, should we be focusing on accounting? How much in the measurement? And the question is not just for our own budget, like even for our own budget, we're using the standard protocol, but it's not effective, right? So the standard protocol basically won't capture any reductions in our supply 3. So and then you can have this accounting of a system that's not capturing the differentiation because of the accounting system. So it's kind of a problem in terms of even incentivizing change. Anyway, I'm babbling now, kind of going through the different challenges we're having in this space from measuring to accounting, and would love your guys' reflections on that. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Amy. Awesome question as usual. Sherwood, Catherine, and Martin, do you want to try to tackle this question?
I can just start off and then let Sherwood and Martin go into detail. Amy, nice to see you, and congratulations. Hope things are going well at Microsoft. I think, what you're addressing, I like to consider in terms of sort of matrix approach. What is it we're measuring? How are we measuring? What data is available? At what level and the scope? And we have different frameworks, everything that has to be pulled together through this. And you're absolutely spot on in terms of the challenge that corporates are facing, in particular, both in terms of the current value chains as well as past footprint. So I think in terms of the scope and the level, that really is viable going forward, and then can be retroactive in terms of what can be measured. But I think the architecture of that, I'll leave that to Sherwood and Martin to discuss, but I'm so grateful to see that type of question coming from yourself at Microsoft, and knowing that your group of scientists are working so hard on this.
Yeah, I'll just say that what you're describing is a major challenge in the space, and that there's not oftentimes open standards, and there's disagreement on how to measure things, and that is normal for kind of an emerging technology in an emerging space. And so the answer, there's not an easy answer. The answer is that different stakeholders need to come together to start hashing out how to measure these things, and that's probably not the answer you want to hear, because it takes a lot of work and it takes a bit of time. But I think that's part of the mission, that's kind of part of our North Star that we're moving towards, is trying to bring people together, and this conversation is part of it. To realize that we need to come together to start coming up with answers to these questions, and the onus is on us to start, and kind of take that initiative. But I'll pass the floor to Martin, because he is definitely much more knowledgeable about the progress that's being made.
Martin, you're still on. Sorry, Martin, you're on mute. We can't hear you. Microsoft needs to come up with an anti-mute function in Teams. Amy, if you're listening, Martin, we can't hear you still. If you can try again, it sounds like your mic's not working.
Well, Martin starts joining. I also wanted to say, I think this also represents a transition from the traditional reporting frameworks that companies have used for their carbon footprint and other SDG goals, right? And this actually is a big part of the paper I've coming out with the UN dialogue, and that is also a transition that needs to happen, right? So the CSR and footprinting methodologies are really based on the HQ and immediate tier 1 activities. And we have actually scope 1, scope 2. The climate emission scope is a big part of this, as well as that capacity to measure outside of those realms and then actually be able to integrate that internally for the company, and then up to those layers from that company level into the sort of national NDCs, and where does that fit in terms of the climate accounting structure? Martin, are you with us now?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect, loud and clear.
Great, awesome. Yeah, I think Catherine sort of touched a little bit of what I was gonna say, inspired by Amy's question. A lot of this is we have to establish a lot of our common agreements of how digital data around climate is shared, is formatted, and is verified. But in many ways, we have a lot of some of those systems in our financial accounting level. When I put all of my backing transactions through QuickBooks, a software system that already uses the formats, ingests all that data, then puts it in an established format, for example, through TurboTax, and that goes into the forms. And in the United States, 300 million people are doing that in some sense. So if we look at the robust level of digital agreements that already we have in financial accounting, there's already a lot to learn there. It has also led to allowing us to, from publicly traded companies, to have very robust financial accounting 4 times a year. And when it comes down to climate, we're going to be seeing our process of accounting once every 5 years. So now that financial accounting parallel can't just come at the country level. What does the global IRS look like? How do we streamline the data in a way that we know what, not necessarily like every format has to be the same, but we have to have a lot of translators. What one country, the way that one enterprise resource planning tool speaks about something could interoperate with another. So that mesh of interoperability is really key, and so it becomes part of why we focus on digital infrastructure.
Thanks very much, Martin. We have a queue of questions. We're not going to be able to get through all of them, but I have a sequence here. I think Annette and Hannah and a number of people had a similar question, and I think Annette ceded the floor to Hannah Krominga. So Hannah's from the Green Tech Alliance, and I'm sure, Hannah, your question is on many people's mind. If you want to take the floor and ask your question.
Yes, great. Thanks so much for this amazing conversation. I'm really enjoying it. So many great minds. So just wanted to say that. Yeah, my question is around blockchain technology and the public discussion. I think we've all been following around the energy use of blockchain technology, and just wanted to find out from you what you know about, the potential innovations in that space and where this technology is going. Because for me, it's still a big question mark.
Yeah, that's a great question, Hannah, and I think important to raise right away, particularly now with a lot of that conversation happening. Trying to associate blockchain with energy consumption, I also think is a big of the problem, because one of the primary sources of energy consumption within the blockchain space is very specific to the protocol used by Bitcoin. And no one really leverages a lot of the Bitcoin network for the type of things that we use. And I think that Bitcoin has the problem that it was a system probably not designed for the scale that it took. So it reminds us of a couple of things. Whenever we design global things that are designed for scale, we need to do some proper agent-based modeling. What does it look like when you multiply by 1000x to make sure it doesn't sort of go out of control? Now, Bitcoin's a problem in and of itself. What can we do with Bitcoin? I also think that powering Bitcoin with renewable energy is not necessarily the answer, because it keeps consuming energy. So we, in some sense, unleashed a monster that now we also have to figure out how to do. And it's a global system. It's particularly interesting because there's no fingers to point at. There's no one to hold accountable. But and I think that either we change the protocol of Bitcoin either through a hard fork, or we have to figure something out. In the Ethereum world, which is another important platform in the blockchain space, the consumption is lower, but they are a lot more active at doing a lot of the proper changes within their proof of work. But also, there's been a lot of innovation on what's called layer 2, so that you don't use the public permissionless layer that's using proof of work and consuming a lot of energy to run all your transactions. That is a very sort of like, we need to be very selective of the open permissionless ledgers that we use and what we use them for. That's why it also goes into the discussion of, should we go through permission or permissionless blockchains? It's not an or question, it's an and. And in some cases, particularly to create networks of trust, permission blockchains become very important. We had this week the Hyperledger Global Forum that's been at the frontier of this for quite some time. But then some specific information that could be published in a public permissionless blockchain can be recorded directly. Now, for most of the other ecosystems, when it comes down to blockchain, proof of work's not being used. So I think that there's a very important point to not fall into blockchain equals energy consumption, and at the same time, yes, our entire digital or an ICT infrastructure has an energy consumption. We also need to figure out how to create some level of constancy, even though the amount of data that we keep ingesting and handling goes up. So a lot of that is to deal with improved sort of compression. But definitely every data server out there should be powered by renewable energy. That is a low-hanging fruit.
And I just want to add on to this. I think it's time for the community to come together and actually update sort of the narrative on blockchain Bitcoin energy consumption and provide sort of that new landscape of permissions and energy usage, and really get the message across about what infrastructure you're using for what use cases. You know, we're not going to be using a freeway to build a parking lot. So let's really focus on how we communicate this. And while we're addressing the energy use of the ICT sector overall, I think that's a really important message here.
Great, thank you both for that comprehensive answer. I'm going to pass the floor to Daniel Swid now for his question. Daniel?
Oh, hey there, David. I didn't really have a question, but I could just say that for Bitcoin, like proof of work, proof of stake, you know, it's really in the model. Like with Bitcoin, we're trading the number of computers for increased security, right? So that's why we have so many computers running. However, at some point, it's asymptotic. Adding more computers doesn't increase the security of the Bitcoin network. So you can still have a proof of work, you know, network with a few computers running that are providing great security. And at some point, it's just like a data center, right? How many computers is Google running to run YouTube, right? It's a similar thing. It's just that the number of computers used can be limited and still provide excellent security. So just on that last point.
Thanks, Daniel.
But it was a great discussion. Yeah, I'm enjoying to listen in on everyone's chats here. So
absolutely, the ICT sector is basically as damaging as the airline sector. So it really is a massive issue that needs to be addressed. And this is just a small piece of this puzzle, but the narrative, definitely we need to improve how we're communicating on this.
That's absolutely true, Catherine. Yeah, I was at VMware for many years, which is helped bring cloud computing to the market, and yeah, we saw a lot on energy consumption and reducing our customers' use of energy by putting utilizing the resources better and better, right? So I think these challenges can be addressed.
Great, thank you very much. I had Richard Munang in the chat, but I think Richard has left, so I'm going to pass the floor to Colin. Maybe one or two more questions, and then we'll get back into the presentations. So Colin, do you want to take the floor?
Thank you. Hi, everybody, and thanks for the great presentations. I'm wondering what extent kind of rowdy activism is part of the solution alongside accounting. Per my chat post there, I think accounting works for companies like Microsoft who are taking responsibility, and huge congratulations to them for really setting a milestone in terms of responsibility for historical emissions. But it's not going to work for Saudi Aramco, Shell, Exxon, and BP. Should we be blockchaining citizen concern around the world, citizen activism, in order to force these non-compliant companies who will kick, scream, greenwash, and lie their way to oblivion? So, accounting, yes, but does that not need to be accompanied by mass participation and mass activism?
Thank you, Colin.
Such an important topic, Colin. Let's not forget some of the usual suspects that comes when we talk about climate change. And I think everyone might have a different view on this. First point I'd like to share that is, one thing is what a company is reporting, the other one is what an independent assessment is also coming up with, and we're moving a lot more to the use of satellite data to be able to verify, let's say, the supply chain of a Saudi Aramco, the inventory of a Saudi Aramco, in an independent way, so that you can always cross-check that. And that's something that we need to move throughout the entire sort of climate space. This is like a double entry bookkeeping system. Tell me what your numbers are saying, and we're going to use sort of different other methods to calculate, so that we have consensus of what that that profile of emissions is for that company. However, one of the most important things to say about the carbon major cohort is, and we, as like you mentioned, activists, we haven't been very clear of what we ask from them. We need to be very clear of saying, well, you need to provide a business model transformation pathway. How are you going to turn your core model into one that is compliant to net zero? And a lot of their outlook reports essentially showcase that they still have a very profitable pathway well beyond 2050. So from an accounting standpoint, it's how year by year, how your changes in your core business model is going to align that, and how credible is that business model transformation pathway. So I've written a paper on, like, just like we have a nationally determined contribution, we should have carbon major determined contributions by really transparently establish those pathways. I'll pass on to any of my colleagues that want to chime in, or anyone else, but I definitely want to put out that point there.
Thanks, Martin. Catherine or Sherwood, do you want to add anything, or do we want to wrap up the round of questions?
I think we can wrap it up.
Okay, great. Let me just then, there's two final questions and then we'll wrap this up. I want to hand the floor to June Bronner, who had a question about digital twins. June, if you want to take the floor, please.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. Super interesting. I just wanted to ask whether you saw any role for digital twins in feeding back climate accounting data, whether on a local or even a global scale, and if so, how do you think we can realize this?
Happy to start there. Super important question, and obviously a very exciting sector to do digital twinning. We started working on digital twins by creating in the renewable energy space, as soon as you have like information about a project, to essentially create a digital twin of the project and all the data streaming, so that when you do monitoring, reporting, and verification of that production, there's a clear comparable, and to be able to establish that, integrating data streams from IoT became very important. Of course, that led to some of the first use cases of NFTs, non-fungible tokens, in the climate world, which was to tokenize unique metadata of a project, of let's say a renewable energy certificate or a carbon offset. But we've moved a lot more from that in terms of digital twins. Perhaps one of the most important projects we can do, all of us together, be part of in the next coming years, is to really establish a digital twin of planet Earth, because more and more we have massive streamlines of Earth system observation data, and that can help us establish a global consensus of what is the state of the planet, and by being able to bake into that a lot of the physical logics of how our planet behaves through integrative assessment models, we're going to be able to ask questions to that digital twin of Earth. And so when we look at, I mentioned just now, business model transformation pathways, if we try to model all of that together, does that digital twin of Earth get to the point where we need to get? Those are the type of questions that we're going to be able to ask that system, of course, powered with AI, and we've been doing a lot of interesting research on how to do that. So large-scale digital twinning of planet Earth, very important, and it's the same thing when we look at natural capital. So from macro to just doing an entire digital twin of the Amazon forest, so we can model different ways so that we can conserve it through multiple projects. Very, very exciting frontier, I think, for the next couple of years.
I would just like to add on to that part of our goal with Open Earth is actually to work with the EU ecosystem, particularly on the the landmark actions that they're taking, Green Data for All and Destination Earth and Digital Earth Twin overall. I'm actually relocating back to Switzerland in a couple of weeks to really take advantage of the EU and UN ecosystem there, to really augment this and bring in alignment between numerous initiatives.
Well, thank you so much.
Great. The final question goes to Matthew. If Matthew, I saw you had your hand up. If you want to take the floor, if you're still with us, it looks like you're having a problem in the chat. But Matthew Bryan, are you on the call still, and do you want to take the floor? Okay, I think Matthew maybe has a problem, and I'm going to also ask Richard. Richard, are you back with us? If you want to take the floor, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, David, and thanks to the presenters for the excellent presentation. My question actually pretty much centers around Article 6.2 of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. What I wanted to get your thoughts on is that with this climate accounting, and given the fact that this is actually a sticking point in the negotiation as a result of double accounting, to what extent do you see this new knowledge emerging, helping to diffuse this contentious issue in negotiations as we move forward? Thank you.
Yeah, this was one of the first questions that we were tackling with the World Bank in the pilot a couple of years ago, with the double accounting question, and this seemed to be like the primary issue that we were addressing, but we've certainly, I'll let Martin take it from where we've come since that initial pilot.
Yes. I saw Colin's respond in terms of the profitable pathway of fossil fuels. I don't know if that was in response to what I said. The biggest problem is that they still have a profitable pathway. We have to make sure that they transform around that. So not saying that need to follow through and find a mechanism that's profitable. We have to be able to transform systems even if they're not profitable, at least in the short term. And that relates to a lot to changing corporate law, actually, from my perspective. Happy to dive a little bit deeper into that, but Article 6.2, super relevant because it goes also to show the importance of how the technology sector needs to be able to inform how policy negotiations are happening, particularly in the lead up to COP26, so that when we think of and negotiate about Article 6, we can also say, what are the tools that help us prevent this, so that we don't have to come with a verbal agreement. Let's say in the San Jose Principles, we come up with a digital standard to be able to allow that. And what I'll talk a bit about it, which has been a part of our work around 6.2 and 6.4 as well, is the importance of using spatially based accounting scopes. Because at the end of the day, an international transfer mitigation outcome is a verifiable digital asset produced in one jurisdiction, moving to another, creating corresponding adjustments between the inventory between those jurisdictions. So that necessitates that our accounting system has to be geo-fenced, which is how also non-state actor data also should roll up to the national inventories. This is one of the things that I wanted to sort of touch base on. Now, all of that's not being discussed when we're trying to discuss Article 6. It's also, we know from Article 6 that countries have the ability to make a decision of whether they want to engage into international transfer mitigation outcomes. But at the same time, it would be relevant to bake into those spatial contracts the fact that if you're not even close to meeting your NDC, why do you want to move your mitigation outcomes elsewhere? Make sure that you meet your NDC, and only if you're an overachiever, you might be able to help someone else. Those are things that are obviously discussed in the hallways when the negotiations are happening, but all these things could be baked into digital contracts, not necessarily forced from the top down, but have those tools available for countries that really want to be that rigorous. They would bake it into their digital standards.
Wonderful. Thanks, Martin. Colin, I see you've got your hand up. Is that from before? You've got your camera on and hand up. Is that from before, or can we switch it back to the presentation mode?
Sorry, that's a legacy hand raise.
Okay, great. Let's wrap this first Q&A up. Really thank everybody for all their engagement. That was some really excellent questions fired at our experts. So let's hand the floor back then to Martin for the second part of this digital discovery session. Martin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Wow, this has been an amazing format. Super dynamic, super informal. Really enjoying this. Before I start sharing my screen, just as a background of how we got into working on climate accounting, and I know that from one aspect, talking about accounting as a very important problem or solution seems like a bit reductionist, but it really comes out of really thinking about our systems. My first encounter to this issue, I did part of my doctoral work on the transformation of carbon majors, but also smart grids, and then bumped into blockchain as useful tools but I had a lot of friends that were doing the unit gap report and calculating the carbon budget, and I was wondering, well, this, if in many ways, a common account that we all share is the atmosphere. So if we look at our atmosphere as that common sort of account and a common ledger, how can we leverage DLTs just to have consensus on the state of the carbon budget? And that led us to a whole pathway of work 3 years later, launching the Open Earth Foundation. So it really started by thinking how to reimagine the management of the atmosphere. And last year we launched the Open Earth Foundation in many ways to research and develop the level of digital infrastructure to do that, not for the next 10 years, but for the next 80 years at least. So the sooner we're able to bring in cutting edge R&D into Earth system solutions, I think that our capacity to manage some of these dynamics at the Earth level will become simpler and definitely sort of also cheaper to deal with. So as a way of background, we've been trying to look at a framework on tackling these issues first from using complex systems perspective, which is a lot focusing on nested systems, and that goes into also how we think about proper infrastructure for climate accounting. Not just blockchain. So we talk about digital technologies as blockchain and IoT and AI and big data, but probably the most important technology that we think we are still yet to master is collaboration. Because to establish global systems that we all agree, this is where it becomes sort of super important, and our capacity to coordinate as a globalized civilization is actually still to be. There's a lot of room for improvement, let's say. And we've talked a lot about this, right? So the fragmentation, the technology sector and the earth science sector are not necessarily really speaking to each other. Every time that I go to COPs, I realize that a lot of the cutting-edge technologies that we have in the world are not necessarily present, and sometimes that becomes very important. So an opportunity for us is to think about how do we actually come up with an operating system for our spaceship Earth. And the internet is kind of the one and only digital infrastructure that we all share, but we really need to be able to align it so that it actually becomes a tool for managing the planet. And that's been sort of our goal, with a focus, of course, on what Sherwood sort of described, our large targets to get to net zero by 2050, which is, interestingly enough, net zero is a term that regards to accounting. Is credits and balances, credits and debits needs to match up. But already being able to quantify the relationship between the budget and the actions of all of us actors, that's a very important link where we need to sort of connect those feedback loops. And when I mentioned that we do robust financial accounting in public companies 4 times a year, that also relates to what's the pulse that we have for the Paris Agreement, right? Countries submit their NDCs and inventories. A lot of that is done through PDFs and spreadsheets, and the UNFCCC has been the heroes really of the room of being able to process and crunch all that data. But all of that takes time, and I think that's probably what led to thinking about the global stock takes as processes that happens every 5 years. Now, from our analysis, how the data is being sourced, reported from an infrastructure standpoint and standardization and being able to bring more efficiency is still highly fragmented. So we need to be able to figure out how this gets properly upgraded, and what are comparable sort of technologies that could be used in this process, because we're going to have to be repeating this constantly. So we might as well bring in all of our best tools.
Martin, I'm going to have to pause you there for a second. We're not seeing your screen, your slides.
Okay. Yeah, so I was just giving the context of the 3 sort of inputs that we try to look at when tackling the different projects: complex systems thinking, technology, but not just blockchain, and then collaboration. That's a lot where I was discussing as a technology in and of itself. Slide 27 just talks a bit about the fragmentation between the technology and the earth science sector, and how these sort of come together ideally so that we can conceive a digital operating system that can help us manage Earth, which again, with digital problems, there's always room for figuring out how these things sort of come together. probably the slide where I was, Sherwood, was slide 29, where I was talking about the pace, the pulse of the Paris Agreement.
Yep.
And so is this working out? Where
I'm following you. Yes.
Okay. So this is the slide where I was talking about the 5-year sort of global stocktake pulse, and how are we able to improve this, so that I think it was one of the things that Sherwood mentioned. We almost can see a future where we have a global stocktake that happens in real time. And what is the process of streamlining data into inventories, into the Secretariat, and then back into, so how do we speed up the feedback loop of data sourcing, data reporting, data aggregation, analysis, and then back into, how does that feed back into our actions? So slide 30, Sherwood, outlines what are the different type of fragmentations we see if we just focus first with our non-state actors, everything from individuals, companies and organizations, cities and provinces and states. What are the levels of motivations and alignments to do proper, robust accounting at the non-state actors? How those properly are integrated into state-level inventories, and that's often not the case. So private sector measures things in this way, inventories sourced from sectorial data sets, but there's a huge opportunity to be able to connect them. And then again, when state actors represent their inventory in sort of static data sets, then the Secretariat sort of has to ingest do a lot of manual accounting and reconciliation to assess constantly that global inventory. And at the same time, that acts as a form of ground truthing from what our Earth observation infrastructure says. Now, these things should act like a double entry bookkeeping system. What the world's reporting should match up with what our satellites and our CO2 sensors are reporting. So these are some like areas where we have a lot of room for improvement. And if we still tackle this level of global coordination in consensus in the state of our climate records, the cost for every global stocktake will be high, and the latency in our data sets continues to be like 1 or 2 years, or sometimes even 3 years. So on the right, I think the opportunity at hand that we see is to establish a level of consensus at the data unit first, as that atomic sort of point where we have to agree whether it's a positive or a negative ton of CO2, and how that properly nests in the spatial footprint of an actor, whether it's the supply chain of a company, rolling up to a city which has its own sort of climate mandates, rolling up to a subnational government, rolling up to the national inventory. And it's not either or. This is, so the next, I'll talk a bit about the importance around doing parallel processes for accounting. But the next slide, 31, if you can see, it should say the Open Climate Framework.
Yep.
And this was the result of our first couple of years of R&D on wrapping our heads around of where we're at with talking about climate and what are the different domains that need to be weaved. And the bottom part, which should be also the foundation, is consensus on the state of the Earth system. So that starts with what I mentioned around agreement on the carbon budget in almost real time. And of course, that needs to be the thing that influences policy, particularly the Paris Agreement. And then we have the world system registries, not just the nations with their inventories, but also the registries of their national actors, the non-state actors, and how these are properly connected from a context standpoint. Within those inventories, we have, and within those actors, we have actions that they take. And then the certification of those actions becomes very important. Here, this is a framework and protocol that we've been sort of working on, how to weave a lot of these things together. We include within modern reporting and verification also emissions, so the verifiability of emissions as actions, mitigations, and of course adaptation, which we often sometimes forget in the context of accounting. And when we have data integrated to properly verify those assets that then reconciled in inventories, some of those, of course, not all of them, can be assetized to be able to be traded. And that goes into, of course, climate markets and the ability of both voluntary but also compliance markets, to use that trusted assetized data for proven actions to those actors. And then that has to wrap into financial triggers. If we have to put $4 trillion by 2030 to decarbonize our economy, we need to make sure that all those dollars are trickling into climate action projects that have proper mitigation outcomes, that are properly verifiable, and then roll up to the inventories. Otherwise, we don't know how well we're doing. And time is so sensitive that if we have some level of latency, we might miss the target if we haven't done in part so already. So how does this relate to a system like this, designed, tested, prototyped, common standards within the current state of the Paris Agreement? So slide 32 shows on one side that, of course, we have the official process, which is strictly a relationship between sovereign nations, countries, and the UNFCCC through the global stocktake. But the proposal is to think about independent climate accounting systems. So one that could bring in all the non-state actors and the voluntary climate data ecosystems together, because their ability to be able to come up with more innovative structures is a lot more nimble. And it's not necessarily having to replace the current mechanisms that the Secretariat uses, but more being able to do that parallel sort of process to check the numbers, and also bake in different voluntary rules. So in the blockchain space, one tool is smart contracts, where if you do something, then another action will ensue. And if we have robust consensus data, then a lot of Earth states and the state of our inventory could trickle in an automation in how carbon pricing kicks into specific actors, how that rolls in to also financing. So the non-state actor world has a lot of the capacity to innovate and also bring in information to the official process. A good example of this in play was probably in the lead up to the Paris Agreement, where the Climate Action Tracker did a proper assessment of the intended nationally determined contribution, that through the official process, that information and that assessment was still not put together. But it was the voluntary sort of climate data ecosystem that was able to put a lot of those analysis. So we went into those negotiations with better tools. So that's the synergy that we can have to not just have to pierce through the legacy system, but work in parallel. So this year we're proposing the launch of that independent climate accounting network, and slide 33 should talk about two parts of that network. One is the digital network, and if we think about the internet, it's a great way of thinking of it as the highways that we have for our data cars to move around, but it's really through the standards where we establish a way that we can communicate on climate and climate data that becomes ideally global, and it has to be from our standpoint connected to the internet. But then there's the network of stakeholders themselves. So to do that, we're putting together different working groups. Slide 34 should show a bit of our first sort of assessment of what are some of the key strategic entities to work on that process. There's, of course, the IGST, the Independent Global Stocktake, whose secretariat sits at the Climate Works Foundation. Very important role to be able to think outside the conventional GST blocks. CAMDA is a very specific sort of network that bridges non-state actor data into state level information, particularly through the Global Climate Action Portal, formerly known as NASCA. So our working group will be sort of launched with CAMDA directly, because they also represent all the traditional nonprofits that have been focusing on climate data, with CDP being one of several ones. And we also have new players in the room, so such as a coalition called Climate Trace that looks at how do we derive inventories from satellite and machine learning tools. So very, very important sort of pieces that we think are key to line up so that we can come up with that vision for an independent climate accounting network. And slide 35, not focusing on the stakeholders, just to show a bit of the data flows. What you may see in the far right, where it says open meta architecture and thoughtware, That is just a first draft of all the data process flows to come up to a consensus of the state of the carbon budget. So there's there's streamlined CO2 sensors from like Mauna Loa and a lot of things that NOAA also aggregates, integrative assessment models like MAGIC that brings in the relationship of CO2 and temperature. And that actually engineering map actually goes towards the right significantly, but we don't have space in this slide to show it. So 36 just shows the result of one of the couple years prototype of what an open climate system would look like, focusing on that nested relationship. And slide 37 sort of brings a bit more of why that spatial context to data is key to be able to integrate non-state actors into the Paris Agreement informally in some sense, through providing that level of context. But it's also the agreement at the data unit level that is key. So slide 38 focuses a bit more on what are the recipes that we need to be able to come up with a common climate action asset in some sense. When I said to be able to have some level of homogeneity of whether you're emitting, that's a ton, or reducing a negative ton in some sense, these things have to match up, whether it's a company doing it, whether it's a voluntary carbon registry sitting in a voluntary carbon registry. And so we have to have the common methodologies, data, protocols, and being able to certify this so that it goes into a level of net zero accounting where those credits and debits sort of match up. And there's been a lot of important work on this of establishing common taxonomies, but also a lot of our work from a technological stack perspective relates to the use of self-sovereign identities and verifiable credentials, which it's a talk unto it in and of itself, but being able to have verifiers query certain information, for example, on a data asset, which could be a ton of CO2 structured, without necessarily accessing the raw data sources, but being able to trust the data derivatives from that data source. At climate action assets, that might not be as relevant, but as soon as we want to look at verifying private sector data, there's a lot more resistance to share raw data sets, and that's important, and that needs to be factored in through the technical architecture. The third point of what we look at is, again, going back into Article 6, is how does this then relate in slide 39, Sherwood, the role of network and trusted climate markets. So that, again, if the atmosphere is the common account that we all share, whatever we do in our markets, officials and unofficials and voluntary, needs to stack up to the same ledger, to the atmospheric ledger, let's say. And the ability for doing that networking has to come in through when we have a taxonomy of how we express a climate action asset, that different registries can understand that. We've done a lot of work in collaboration with the World Bank for how blockchain technologies can help in the process of Article 6. That project is still ongoing, but this is a lot of what I'm showing has also helped inform the architecture of these pilots. But they're not necessarily fully considering yet the role of private sector accounting into it, and that's really what we're seeing a lot of activity in the space is companies, of course, wanting to offset their emissions and going into voluntary carbon registries. Hopefully this just gives you an overview of the type of projects that we're doing, and there's no way that one single entity can address these issues. Slide 40 just shares a bit of the outcomes of this from a point of critical sort of next steps and actions. There are a lot of pilots going on and a lot of POCs from a technology standpoint, but the main thing we need, I think, to do at the moment is bring in a level of integration pilots, because sometimes the pilots and the POCs that groups do are related to how can this technology be applied to this field, and that's the driver of it, just to explore it. However, it's very different if one tackles a pilot from what's the ultimate system that we need to achieve and what is a fractal of it that already has all that integrated, connected. Those are the type of things, and particularly look at the nuances of private-public interfaces. And I can mention one project that we are doing on this to also understand what are the best blueprints of those integration pilots, so that those proven fractals can then be replicated in scale, but have a consistency in the common architecture. The type of multi-stakeholder collaboration networks are also key, but those working groups have to have a lot of action associated to it. So this is a bit of what we are discussing a lot with the Camden network. How to ensure that we don't just do roundtables, that we use them to turn out climate standards and that are pushed out, and then the world can sort of further review, and that those milestones are baked into those working groups. And then we have to realize that if we are shooting for an integrated sort of Earth system management layer, that has to be open source, that digital infrastructure has to be a digital public good. And coming from the open source world, this is sometimes extremely hard to finance because it's a bit of a gray area. Who's supposed to finance the highways for climate infrastructure? The private sector often says, well, we're doing our own thing with our ERPs, and we're doing some form of work around integration. But being able to understand the value of these sort of collaborative endeavors in the open source space are crucial. That's a lot why we've been doing a lot of work with Linux. They're by far extremely knowledge on how to actually make that happen. Those are just some 3 thoughts, and I'm sure Sherwood and Catherine will have other things to share. And I just wanted to mention one example of those in slide 41, integrated pilots that we're starting really soon with the government of British Columbia. Often when we do a lot of pilots with governments, it's the government official that is following along in the technology discussion. British Columbia actually is a core maintainer of a framework called verifiable credentials within the Linux Foundation. So they already roll out self-sovereign identities to individuals and to corporations. And they do that to protect the individuals and the corporations from the government themselves. A self-sovereign identity allows you to be owner of your data. So we've been super excited to work with BC and Microsoft, Copper Mountain, PwC in the context of how do we properly verify not just the emissions from, let's say, a mine site, but also associated to the products. So the products that come out of the mine site could be verified by a buyer, let's say someone that buys copper somewhere else in the world. And what happens when you move a product with a specific carbon intensity across jurisdictions. Slide 42 just showcased some of the frameworks that go into it, with the copper mining being in the heart of the supply chain, but at the top starting with remote sensing, the importance that if a corporation that runs a mine site is saying that they're emitting X, but satellite data is showing a different value, that is very important to be able to reconcile. And it showcases in the line that says GHG profile that we have to look at verifiable climate credentials for the company, for their site, and for the product. And obviously, this also has to ideally automatically roll up to ESG values, because that's also the information that investors have to be able to decide whether to keep funding those corporations. And then I framed this within the spatial jurisdictions that I've been sort of keep going back at, the role that British Columbia as a subnational government sits within the Canadian context. This is just one example of how multiple stakeholders come together to test one model that ideally is scalable and replicated into other jurisdictions. If it's done properly as open source, this becomes a core part of technology transfer, which is part of the Paris Agreement. I'll pause there. Maybe Sherwood, you have something to say for the next slide, and love to go back into this dynamic discussion that we were having before and see what questions come up.
Yeah, I'll make this very quick. Yeah, so because I want to get to the Q&A. So I wanted to give a quick plug for Hyperledger, the Climate Action and Accounting Special Interest Group that I'm co-chairing. It's an example of one of the multi-stakeholder collaboration networks that Martin mentioned we're very much a working group that kind of has a bunch of different action labs. So you can kind of think of it as a sandbox for kind of working towards building different aspects of this kind of global accounting framework. We have different working groups: carbon accounting and certification working group. We have a standards working group, consumer disclosure, a research working group. We're actively trying to build awareness and capacity in the space. And I just want to invite everybody on this call, because I think everybody on this call definitely has a role to play, to come check us out. We have a bi-monthly general meeting. We have one coming up this Tuesday, and there's a link below there where you can come visit us. But if you just type in CA2SIG, CA2SIG, that'll provide you the pathway to find us. And then I'll just stop there. But thanks for letting me promote it.
Great, thank you, colleagues. That was fantastic. My mind is successfully blown. I'm going to take a couple of days to digest that presentation. The level of thinking you put into this is truly phenomenal. So we thank you very much for presenting it and really firing us up. Let me open the Q&A. I think, Nicholas, I'm going to hand the floor back to you. You had put the first question in the chat, so Nicholas Hegelberg, if you want to take the floor, thank you very much. It looks like Nicholas might either be muted or he has temporarily left the conversation. Nicholas, if you're there, we can take your question whenever you want. I'm going to pass the floor then to Toyo. Toyo is also a UNEP colleague working in this space with a lot of expertise on blockchain. Toyo, do you want to take the floor, please?
Yeah, thank you, David. This is not a question, but more like the comment. But I found the independent accounting network based on the nested account system sounds very interesting, because basically in the Paris Agreement, countries submit nationally determined contributions, which is the country's national commitment to the climate mitigation and adaptation targets, and the stock taking of their efforts, countries' efforts, will be based on their NDCs, but NDC might not cover all the economic sectors. But what Martin mentioned as independent accounting network, it's able to capture all the emission reductions made from the project on the ground. So I think it's very much complementary to the official GST process. So yeah, I just wanted to share this comment because I thought it's very interesting. So thanks.
Thanks, Toyo. And in many ways, we also are interested in the model and the capacity as a way of reimagining different multilateral actions, not just around climate, whether the civil society or nonprofit and non-state actor world can come up with coordinated systems that actually bolster the official processes and maybe cover some gaps, as you mentioned. And I think that that's a very important also mindset, rather than pointing fingers or criticizing any mechanism that's ongoing, is doing parallel processes that just help support. And if there's gaps that it could be filled. That's, I think, where we can also bring in a vision for collaboration rather than trying to divide solutions.
Thanks, Martin. Nicholas is having trouble taking his microphone off mute. Nicholas, I can ask your question as well. Nicholas is saying there's quite a number of proponents for blockchain solutions for accounting and transparency. What can the UN do to help formalize the process? And what efforts can we take so that we start taking baby steps forward to digitalize parts of the Paris Agreement?
I have sort of two quick thoughts on that. One is it's very important for the UN to work on the common frameworks, so that everyone that's doing different pieces of the puzzle at least falls into that framework and they know where they fall within the map. And those type of exercises could come from different sectors, but I think coming from the UN would be very helpful, because it creates the field. Otherwise, a lot of those blockchain climate accounting things become fragmented. The other one would be a lot of into those integrated pilots and stakeholder groups to define standards. So having the United Nations as a platform that convenes again into saying, here's one sector, climate and accounting. How do we create a cadence into the right actors to work together on a common way in which they all speak to each other in the same format, and that the framework also supports the ongoing mechanisms that the UN uses. I think that's the type of thing that becomes very useful. So a lot more experienced technologists in the UN, like David, we need more of that for sure.
And I would love to augment that and also say, having worked with so many of the amazing, exciting labs across different UN agencies, this is also where we can focus on integrating tech right from the start. We have so many accelerators and labs sort of building out across the UN agency and landscape. If we start from the very start, ensuring that the calls for innovation and the calls for technology actually match up with this type of framework and or the problem holders themselves in terms of that space, that is really an essential part. We need to mature the accelerator approach to more of a scaling and integrator approach.
Yeah, I love that idea. And I have a question now for all of you, and that's, so we've been talking a lot about kind of climate action, but there are sort of other integrated challenges that we have to deal with at the same time. So we've got, biodiversity conservation, we've got pollution and chemicals. Any ideas on how we can also begin to sort of, as you say, Martin, start that integration process so we're not building a climate silo, but we're building this Earth operating system, as you say. So how do we concretely take this idea forward and bring more of that into an integrated framework?
Yeah, and if we think about net zero as a clear goal within climate, 30% by 2030 of conserving our oceans and land is also a very straightforward framework, and a lot of that is to ensure that our data infrastructure is properly spatialized. That's definitely becomes a very important piece of how we manage land-based conservation, particularly ocean-based conservation, because oceans have no boundaries. And so if we want to bring in technology, for example, and this is a project that we're going to start doing research on at the end of this year, how do we bring a lot of this digital integration to improve how we manage marine protected areas, where you have to deal with illegal shipping and often you don't have any visibility of the area. So this is a lot where common spatial protocols become very important. In the climate modeling world, that evolved into having to create the Earth System Grid Federation, so that all climate models are at least speaking about the same way of where the model is running on Earth. And that's a good example of global coordination that had to happen, so that we have models like the CMIP, the Coupled Model Comparison Project, is that you have to, all the modelers out there have to agree on an Earth System Grid Federation, which is a spatialization of data models, then allow a lot of those integrated assessment models to come together, and we wouldn't be able to have the level of assurance of 1.5 degrees without that work. So going back to biodiversity, it's that agreement on how we spatialize that data and how that often sort of speaks to each other that becomes super critical. That's why a big part of our research is on the concept of spatial web.
Yeah. I would add that if you look at the SDGs as a whole, 68% of the 93 indicators that cover the environmental dimensions alone of the SDGs currently cannot be measured due to the lack of global data. And of these, 17 environment-related indicators have to be underpinned by geospatial data. So already that's just one area that really needs augmenting and innovation. And I think the processes of innovation, again, I'm always about the process of collaboration and integration. The lessons we're learning in this sort of sector are very applicable across the Sustainable Development Goals, starting with environment, but across the clusters of ESGs as well.
Thanks. And just to flag that UNEP's been given a mandate by the UN Environmental Assembly to develop what they're calling a global environmental data strategy. And obviously, spatial data should underpin that strategy, as a core element. I'd love to come back to you on that question of, as we roll this out and begin the consultation process, how can this global environmental data strategy actually add real value to this conversation rather than being just a paper tagger? So it would be great to come back to you on that specific question. I can see that various colleagues are having trouble with the chat. For some reason, Walker Young from Apple has been kicked off, and Thomas from IBM has been kicked off. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what MS Teams is doing right now to other colleagues. But Walker or Thomas, if either of you want to take the floor for a question, please just do so. Otherwise, I'm going to look around for any other hands up or any other commenters that want to take the floor. Colin, I see that your hand is up. I'm not sure if that's an old hand or not, but Colin, if you want to take the floor again, please go ahead. Colin, if you're talking, you're on mute. So if you want to take your mic off.
I've managed that.
There you go.
Yeah, that was a non-legacy hand this time. Yeah, I just wanted to. I'm in a systems change group full of brilliant people, but they're still, this is about climate. This isn't about biodiversity. And then, the SDGs are all about integration of human issues with environmental issues, et cetera, et cetera. Just really emphasizing how the siloing is still prevalent amongst highly intelligent people, especially even systems thinkers who should be the people doing the opposite of that. And then I was explaining to another colleague yesterday, she was talking about, such and such a foundation focuses on people, they're not terribly focused towards the environment. And we were talking about women's issues. And of course, if a woman's walking 10 kilometers a day to fetch water, she's not getting she's not getting educated. And, all of these things are integrated. And I guess, this is coming from David, a UNEP type focus, but we really need to keep it broad and make sure that, that geospatial data is also including migration, is also including empowerment of people, which we all know to be critically, important, but often neglected. So.
Yes, absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more.
Thanks, Colin. I'm going to just see if Kevin Hartman wants to take the floor. Kevin had a question a little while ago. Kevin, if you're still on the call, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. I wrote my question before seeing Martin's presentation, but I think there is, maybe following up on this, it seems like having a global blockchain put together to track emissions across the supply chain is going to be quite the task. And my question is, can we in the meantime develop a proxy along the lines of using geospatial data, using satellite imagery, applying sensors across the world, where there are suppliers, manufacturers, to start to track and record what is truly being emitted, and then using that data, recording of that level of information, combined with what the organizations are publicly releasing, like the number of products that they produce, the number of products that they release, and then having a score related to divide through the number of products produced by the emissions at those locations across the sourcing, and having a way to add it up that way and coming up with a carbon score. Is that I mean, just thinking almost out of the box, is that something that could be considered as a step toward reaching this other goal of having a more exact ledger, which would be ideal, but it might take a long time to get there. I'm concerned about the timing of having that precise data with maybe what could be a proxy instead.
Yeah, that's a great point. And to clarify, I think what at least I can present is not the vision that we have to have one single ledger. It could be built from multiple different data sources, but whatever goes into the ledger has to be agreed upon. And one way to do that is exactly how you described it, where satellite data is being used to verify emissions on the ground, and so you're able to properly attest to what should be the accounting of a, for example, specific company or product generation. And then these are not sort of separate, because that a trusted sort of ledger has to be fed from exactly sort of what you described. And it's very important that that data set for coming in from remote sensing is also sort of agreed upon, and those data streams come in and provide sort of right context. Is it measuring what for what organization, and what are the methodologies used to say this is the type of carbon intensity of that organization? That ideal could be done totally independently. Now that organization can then do its own accounting itself, and you have to match it with what you described. And then if they properly manage, then it goes into a consensus or ledger saying like, yes, there's not a lot of variability here. So just wanted to point out that it's not an or, again, it's an and what you describe is spot on, a type of those fractal mechanisms that I was describing of what would be one application.
If I might throw a spanner in the works, I also, I think as we build out these systems, I always take that meta view as well. And having just completed this massive UN study on big fintechs and their impact on SDGs and climate, we also have to remember while we're building out these and sort of addressing the data issues for value chains and supply chains, we have to remember that the business models of companies are becoming much more convoluted, complex, and integrative, wherein the actual impacts, only a fraction of them being measured. So while we're building out these systems, we also have to consider how are we going to even have visibility on those impacts, as well as being able to measure those impacts. And I take, for example, here, the e-commerce marketplaces, Amazon, which are literally taking over global marketplaces as well as the smaller consumers. And while at the same time they're providing core data on their HQ operations and their own brands, there's 50% of the activities that they're doing are becoming even more opaque. So we also have to start grappling with, what are the capacities and what are the business models that we can bring in, or the tech models that we can bring in, if there's any, to address that impact, because it is a growing question and a growing concern.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, and I think the other thing we have to do is reach out to Amazon and ask them what are their pain points in becoming more transparent across their marketplace, right? How can they bring in on board this kind of performance data directly into the marketplace? Because I know they have some core challenges in terms of which data do they bring in, what do they trust?
Exactly.
But I think we need to work hand in hand with them to understand those pain points and try to address them head on.
Actually, on that point, we actually independently have a proposal out that we hope to launch with the big fintechs in particular on that, helping them to benchmark those things. So it does have to be absolutely collaborative.
Exactly. We've got 5 minutes left in the call. I see. I think people their minds are really full now, and so I suspect they're processing. I just wanted to see if Cyril wanted to take the floor about geospatial data. I can see a remark in the chat. Cyril, if you want to take the floor, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, David. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Sorry, my French accent. I hope you're all fine. Greetings from Liverpool. I come from the climate community, so I'm more like one of those guys who play with the computers, entering the numbers and play with those files, doing other things as well on health and many other things. And I think I found this file formatting by, I think it's America, it's Unidata who kickstarted that. It's been used widely by NCAR, NASA, NOAA, by PCC, UK Met Office. I mean, all the geophysical data now. Using that file format, there are other options, but I think that's, I've been using that for more than 15 years, and I think more and more people are using this file formatting. It's available, you can read it with whatever software you like, whatever library, whatever system, whatever architecture, available on several server types as well. So I think it's that's an option. There are others. I think there's another JSON, like some kind of shapefile in Java that's quite compressed and quite efficient as well. There are other options, but I think by experience, I think that's something that should be useful, in particular when you want to georeference something on a grid, 3D, even 4D or 5D, if you think about those things, altitude, time. So these data are very useful. They've been very useful for my research, and they've been useful, I think, for the whole community as a whole, for everybody, for the IPCC. And thanks. Just a comment.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Cyril.
Cheers.
Maybe if I can add to that comment, just to ask a question back to the colleagues. What do you think the role of the major cloud providers is going forward in terms of generating and helping to generate these new standards? Do you think Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and all the other major cloud providers should be rallying together to really come together to come up with a standard? And how do you think that process might look so that has a public trust component to it?
Yes, great point, great question, and that from Cyril's point, that was very illustrative of the importance of digital infrastructure, and a common sort of data format standard is an example of that infrastructure. And I was smiling because there's a part of me that thinks it's probably going to be way easier to bridge the silos in the data world that the silos at the institutional and personal level. Because once data formats become sort of adopted or protocols, they could be sort of globalize themselves. And it doesn't matter if the institutions are still fragmented, at least that we use the same data formats. And the cloud providers have a very important opportunity there, because in many ways, they can take the role of the air traffic controller. If we don't have the same formats, our planes are going to crash. So the air traffic controller needs to be able to say, hey, I see that you're moving around, but you're not using these standards. And it's also the level of technology that allows a cloud sort of provider to be able to verify certain formats without having access to the data. So not necessarily having to access the data of its clients in some sense, but at least being able to audit the formats and say, hey, I see that you're not complying with this format. You could use this other one. Here's a library of standardization. And so they can play a very important role in driving that digital infrastructure, combining, what Cyril said.
Thanks, Martin. I'm gonna just we've got 2 minutes left. I can't hold back with one more question. The Internet Governance Forum. The Internet Governance Forum recently launched a policy network on environment and digitalization. I'm wondering if you have some advice for the IGF on the role it could play in brokering these conversations and sort of helping take this vision forward.
Sherwood, I think that's a great question for you, being an ICANN person.
Yeah, man, I think that I think it's a really good forum to begin the discussion. I think it's about bringing together all the different stakeholders in the space, and at this point, I think it's awareness building. I think IGF is a great platform to build awareness around a broad group of stakeholders that we need, in the room, kind of discussing these matters and kind of digging into these problems now. So I think it's a very kind of opportune time. And I think it's a good platform, and we've definitely submitted to take part. So hopefully we'll be able to have a discussion there.
We also have a lot to learn from the internet world. The internet world works by consensus on certain layers of the cake, TCP/IP being at the bottom part, and then laying it HTTP, and then we've got HTML, and if you're using emails, it's SMTP. And so if we look at what that stack would look like for climate, and how the internet has managed to establish those common protocols, in many ways we have to have an internet climate protocol. And so learning through Internet Global Forums, learning from the history of how these protocols came to be and how they're managed, I think the climate world has a lot to borrow from that.
And that, I guess that applies to the concept we've been kicking around called Earth APIs. Could we come up with a standard set of Earth APIs that would cover this whole space? So what's so just last question there. Again, where do we land that conversation technically? What's the right body or the standard organization to really start engaging with directly to build that kind of data standard and that interoperability?
I think it's hard to say which is one entity, right? I think that it's very important for more and more the UN to play a very active role in that, 100%, and also the scientific institutions play an active role in that. But there's a lot of room for nonprofit organizations and civil society to play a role in those consortiums. And the beauty of open source development is that there's often a place where that is parked and there's a bit of a secretariat, but it's open to anyone. So that's I think where the dynamics of open digital communities put with the right sort of like consortium of actors that can probably safeguard the broader systems and frameworks that we need to achieve becomes key. But I think it's more of a mesh. And I think it's open for any group to say, hey, we've designed this protocol, we think it could scale, and it just starts getting adopted.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. We're now out of time. That was a fantastic session. I really can't thank the three of you enough for all the thinking you've done in this regard. I mean, that was just a huge vision. And I think a lot of the colleagues in the call really got motivated and inspired that this is possible. As you say, we now have the technology to where this is possible, whereas 10 years ago we simply didn't. And now it's around, as you rightly pointed out, human collaboration, collective action. How do we take this forward systematically and collaborate to take this vision forward? So I couldn't agree more that this is really a human problem now rather than a technical one. And we really look forward to collaborating with you going forward on how we do that. So we will follow up directly with you, especially in terms of what we can do and what this global environmental data strategy could do. And I just, again, thank you so much for spending the time with us and sharing your expertise, your vision, your knowledge, and inspiring us today.
Amazing. Thanks to you, David.
Thank you.
This happened.
Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thanks again.
Cheers, everyone. I'll put my email in case anyone wants to follow up.
And Martin, if you can send me the PowerPoint or somebody send me the PowerPoint, I'll send it to everybody as well as the video. That would be great.
We'll include our contacts there.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Cool. Have a great day, everyone. Cheers.